Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. I would like to talk a little bit about the last three books that I have read. After finishing Elaine Chang's Lost Caution, I went into People of the City by Cyprian Ekwensi. He was an immensely successful Nigerian author. This, I think, might have been published in 1960 something. And it's divided into two halves, and I loved the first half. I can't speak highly enough of how much I enjoyed that. And then, come the second half, I felt the book did not live up to its potential. It disappointed me in many ways, and I grew not to care much about any of the characters. This one died, and I didn't care. And the end was sort of arranged, something of a happy ending, you could say, by a deus ex machina, if that's the correct way to say that term, where all of a sudden some acts of God or whatever come in and just kill off that person that needs to be removed for another thing to happen. And there is also a pregnancy which is removed in something of a ugly way, I guess you could say. And then the two characters get together and it's a happy ending. But after all of that, it didn't really seem to justify very much happiness to me. After that, I went to an old stand by George Eliot. I was debating this or the other George Gissing, and noted that his book was 550 pages, so I went with this George, not really knowing anything about this. I knew it. This edition had an introduction by Q.D. Leavis, and I wanted to look at that. So I read this book, and everything I said about the deus ex machina can also be said to a character here. A character needs to be gotten rid of, and it just so happens that the hand of God comes in and gets rid of that character. Of the three Eliot novels, it's probably my least favorite so far, but I did enjoy it. I think you begin to build up a track record with an author, and then you give them more latitude to do things than an author that you're fresh with. And so, the as with Romola, somebody walks into a blind alley or whatever, and suddenly the person that they've been looking for 20 years or whatever just happens to be in that alley, and I understand she wants to get the story moving and doesn't want to waste time on all of those details to make it more plausible. That said, this fits into the category of a book that has a lot of characters that are fairly unappealing, honestly. The only appealing character really is Silas Marner himself. And in a certain sense, it reminded me of Edith Wharton's book, Ethan Frome, in that it's really something of a pared down tale, and it follows one character pretty closely. Now, Silas Marner is an outsider. He comes from elsewhere, from a different religious circumstance, and you get a little bit of the background as to why he left that community and establishes himself in a new place. And then he, over time, begins to ingratiate is not the right word, because it's not really something he does intentionally, but he begins to mesh himself more smoothly into the community than he had been at first. But as I say, the other characters with whom he interacts are mostly somewhat unappealing people. And there's a certain climax to events, and it all ends happily. At one point, he takes a trip back to the town from which he came, which you're expecting that there's going to be more to it than that, and it kind of leads nowhere. And I almost had the feeling this was a book that Eliot did while she was preparing in her mind to do Romola. And I almost had the feeling that she wrote the book with the intention of having more to do on his return to the old town after he's grown and changed. And then when she got to that point of writing that, she said, I'm almost at a full-length novel here, and I'm kind of bored with this, and so she just let that go. That's the impression I had. Whether there's any reason to support such a speculation, who knows? So there was that. And then The Siege of Krishnapur by J.G. Farrell was the most recent thing that I've finished. And this one I truly wound up loving. I had started it earlier, I can't remember before which of these, and put it aside because I had read something that talked about the similarities between all of Farrell's Empire trilogy books, this being the second one, Troubles being one that I read very recently. And having read the book now, I can affirm that there are a lot of plot similarities. Characters are, at first, when you start following the main character in this, you find him hard to distinguish from the main character or one of the main characters in the Troubles. And then there's a young man here that's kind of like the young man in the Troubles. But the scenario is very different. Here, Farrell takes it back further to 1850, 1860 in a cantonment in India. And the major action of the story is the siege of that cantonment. And it's a harrowing tale. And as with Troubles, somewhere around the 3/4 mark, he introduces a scene that is just laugh out loud, hilarious, and it's the thing that makes me want to go and return to Farrell again for his third in the trilogy, which is called The Singapore Grip. It's a fatter book than this, maybe by twice, I'm not even sure. And I thought about plunging right into it, but I've just come off of 2 months of solid fiction reading, and that's enough for me. I'm ready to move into nonfiction. So I will hold off on that, but this was definitely worth reading. You get a different perspective on the Victorian era. You see what these British colonialists were up to in India, and everything is told from the perspective of these colonialists and company men as they're trying to promote their, I guess you would say, white supremacist vision of the world on top of these native inhabitants. And, the consequences are, I suppose, in a sense, a metaphor for what any of us humans in our somewhat empirical positioning in the planet may have to look forward to as things begin to turn against us. What was it Pericles had said? What you hold is, to speak plainly, tyranny. Wrong, perhaps, to have taken, but dangerous to let go. And you see that. The book is, as I say, witty, it's poignant. It's perhaps a little bit flat in certain ways, but any book that causes me to laugh like that, I'm not going to complain about. So I did a count of the books that I read in 2 months, and I read 2 months worth of fiction because I had just read 2 months worth of nonfiction, and I was shocked at the number of books that I was able to fit into that span of time. Now, some of them were short books for Shorty September, but there was a video recently that Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads put up, in which he answered I think it was a tweet by some person who complained about people who boast of reading 100 books a year. Like that was an impossible feat. And with the number of books I read in the past 2 months, if I kept at that rate, I would easily do like 200, 208, something like that, books in a year's time. And that's with not every single book being a short book, and with not every moment of my time being particularly well dedicated to reading. I didn't have the ideal amounts of time at my disposal either. In the end, I think that counting the number of books is not really helpful because, just before that I read some nonfiction, and say you take the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn as one book. Well, that's one book, but it's 2,000 pages or whatever, compared to something that's less than 200 pages. But I thought that Greg's answer to the tweet, or the message that he had read wherever, was very appropriate. And I just happened to reflect upon that when I tallied up my numbers. The numbers are not really useful to me in any way, particularly because I was in the middle of some big works when the year transitioned, so I have no way to get a clean number at the end of the year. But perhaps I will talk about this in greater detail in a future video. I think it's an interesting topic. So these are the 3 recent books, and now it is on to nonfiction. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.